Welcome to the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast. My name is Ryan Palm, and I am the Executive Director of the Brad McGarry Center for Neurodiversity at Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania. On this podcast, I'm joined by several amazing students from our program who are helping with the behind-the-scenes element of this production. Thanks, as always, Jack and Gia. This podcast aims to be a resource for those who are interested in the intersection between higher education and neurodiversity. Whether you are a prospective student, family member of a student, or someone working within the sector, we're really glad that you're here. Over the coming months, we will bring on a variety of thought leaders on topics relating to neurodiversity and higher education, with a particular emphasis on the transition into higher education and the transition from higher education into the workforce. We very much welcome your feedback, suggested topics, speakers, or thoughts on our episodes. We can be reached by email, neurodiversity@mercyhurst.edu, or please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll also put information on how to connect in our show notes for each episode. We'll talk more about how to stay engaged later in this episode. Today we welcome Brandon Slade. Brandon is the founder and Chief Innovation Officer at Untapped Learning. Brandon has 15 years of experience in the fields of education, foster care, and school psychology. At Untapped Learning, Brandon and team provide executive function support for students in middle school through college. Their practice continues to grow. We'll learn a little bit about the origin story, some of his observations during their growth, and a lot of practical suggestions on how neurodivergent students can improve their executive function skills. Without further delay, let's welcome Brandon Slade to the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast. And welcome in Brandon Slade. Brandon, thank you so much for taking some time to join us on the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast.
Ryan, I'm so excited to be here and I'm so excited to talk to you again.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you and I were connected, I think, through a third party somehow. I don't even remember exactly how that was, but it was probably a year and a half ago now. And ever since then, we've had a few really good conversations, really focused on, how can we best support the students that are in our ecosystems and help spread the word about all the good things that are happening. So I'm really excited about this conversation today. I think it could go a lot of different directions, but we're going to try and sort of stick to a script and not get too distracted. But I wondered if you could just get us started by telling us a little bit about your background and what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, the 10,000 foot view is that I was diagnosed with hyperactive ADHD at a young age. I was that kid all over the place and just trying to figure out how to fit in a general education setting. And I had two younger brothers like me, so the house was constantly chaos, and it was this beautiful, chaotic place to live, but it caused a lot of academic challenges. So I was able to get through elementary, middle school, and high school okay, and then I went out to Ohio on a football scholarship, and I just bombed. When that transition, which I'm sure you see all the time, from the structure of a household and someone planning your day for 7 periods, and then after school for sports, and then being independent and having to manage all this on your own, I just fell apart. And so thank goodness I had some great people in my life kind of show me the ropes, and I had to take the long way around. But after that, I became a special education teacher, a school psychologist, and then I would do a lot of work in foster care, and just really have been fascinated with these executive function skills. And then about 8 years ago, I made the jump, and we decided to help as many kids as we could with these skills. And it's been a very interesting, fun, exciting, challenging path.
That's awesome. And I appreciate your sharing that. It's, that structure and the transition from this really highly rigid structured environment that most students leave, high school from, and then transitioning into college is probably the thing I talk with, families the most about, right? Like what's going to happen and who's going to help them. And there's lots of great programs like the one we have at Mercyhurst that help do that. But I think there's also a lot of outside support that can help during the high school years and into the transition into the college years. And that's why I thought it'd be really helpful to have a conversation with you, someone who lives in this executive functioning coaching side of the house that's a little bit different from those we've talked with so far on this podcast. So when we talk about executive functioning, how do you define that term?
Yeah, the most basic way I've heard that I really like is it's the complex set of skills that all work together so you can achieve your goals, right? So we could break that out into things like time management and metacognition and working memory, but essentially you're just trying to reach your goals. And your goal could be something big, like you want to get into a certain university, or you want to make the dean's list. And it's your executive function skills that help you break down that goal into small, manageable steps and get from beginning to end to achieve that goal. And they help you reorient when things go sideways. But they'll also help you reach small goals. Things like, I want to show up to class on time today. I want to remember both of my hockey skates and not be that student athlete out there with one skate, right? It's big goals and small goals, and just how do we reach those goals?
That's awesome. So you've given a few examples, but I think it's helpful to provide context in terms of maybe within your coaching practice and the conversations you've had with students that you've helped, some specific examples about what do we mean in terms of executive functioning support in the day-to-day life of a student. When you think about that high school junior or senior who's thinking about that transition to college, are there common themes or common topics that you're talking about with them?
Oh, yeah, there's a ton right now. The first is teaching. When executive function support is done well, you're teaching students how to set up systems. I'm sure you see this all the time, but our students try to keep everything in their heads, right? And their brain is for having ideas and not holding ideas. And when we get that out of our head, first of all, you'll see anxiety drop significantly. But after that, so many of our high school students don't have systems. They show up on campus and they've always been able to keep everything in their head, and then it falls apart. So that's one common theme we're seeing a lot. The second one is procrastination. I mean, 8 years ago when we started Untapped, that was like 25% of my job. That's like 100% of my job today is how do I help these kids? And to be honest, us as adults too, beat this procrastination monster.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm going to ask you some questions maybe when we hang up about procrastination. Because
I love giving advice that I don't necessarily follow myself. Sometimes you know the research and then you get stuck in the scroll, and it's so hard because it's eating all of us up. But it's especially eating our students up who are used to their parents tapping them on the shoulder and be like, okay, it's time to get started now.
And I think too, at least in my experience, one of the big differences between high school and the college transition for a lot of majors, at least, is this idea of these big projects, right? You've got to write a 25-page paper, or you have a semester-long research project. And I think for a lot of our students, that's way more challenging than the smaller, shorter, simpler tasks to complete. It's this idea of how do I take this big giant thing and chunk it into something that's more meaningful and manageable. I feel like we spend a lot of time when we meet with our students doing just that, chunking projects into smaller tasks that hopefully 6 weeks at a time lead to success, rather than, kicking that proverbial can down the road forever, knowing that there's this big looming project at the end of the semester that may be really difficult to achieve. Is that something you're seeing in your practice?
Oh, absolutely. And then that's why your program is so wonderful. And some of these other programs we see as well is you're providing that structure and that accountability, and then you're slowly easing off, right? It's, when you have this big thing like pass your classes in college, for a lot of our students, it's hard to break that down. It's like, what's step one? What's step two? Whether it's a project, studying for a test, or passing a class. And when you do that and you give students 2 pats on the back and 1 kick in the tail, like a lot of love and a lot of accountability, what happens is that they develop these skills.
That's awesome. I think one of the challenges that some of families that we seem to talk with face is this idea of where does support come from at the higher education level. I think for many families in the high school level, their support maybe comes from one person. That one teacher is helping with executive functioning support, but they're also the content master, right? They help figure out the problem. And they may also help provide other reminders about make sure you go to the other classes on time and make sure you put your stuff in your locker, whatever. All those pieces can sort of be handled by one person. And at the college level, that often is not the case, and it may vary school by school and the school size. But, how do you think about executive functioning as it might differ from academic tutoring or study skills support at the higher education level?
Yeah, one of the things, again, I really enjoy about your program, and a few others they've started to spring up, is that for the students we've identified, with ADHD, maybe dyslexia on the spectrum, for the students we know will probably have a challenge with this transition, having one check-in person is just such a game changer right off the bat. I know I was helping a student at a large university the other day, and it looks great in a brochure. They have all these tutoring centers, they have all these tutors, but it's like the student needed help in like I think it was econ or something. We're trying to figure out where to even go. There was so much stuff. And I think that trips a lot of our students up too, is we throw all these resources at them, but they kind of need that one check-in person to build these skills. And then again, after your first semester, first year, we can ease off of that. But that's one recommendation I'd have for higher education is how do we facilitate that? Because subject level tutors are going to be great, but they don't really help you put it together. And I think that's what a lot of our students need in this transition.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. We'll probably unpack a few more of those things as we go, but I don't want to get too far into the conversation before I bring up one of my favorite topics that I just love in terms of Untapped Learning's approach towards helping support students, and that's movement and the idea of physical activity and health and overall wellness and well-being. It's something I'm passionate about and something I talk with a lot of our students about. It seems as though it's a core principle in terms of how you approach the way you support students. I don't think it's something that's widely used across the board in support type settings. So I'd love to hear, why has that been a key part of your practice? How do you see that going forward? And just, tell me about that for a while.
Yeah, one of the challenges we see is that, especially for parents, when they get a diagnosis or they're transitioning their student to college, we want to jump right to accommodations. We want to give a student every single accommodation possible. And don't get me wrong, those can be helpful, but those are kind of at the top of the pyramid. When we look at the bottom of the pyramid, the things that really impact executive function development the most, we look at sleep, we look at movement, we look at structure, and we look at routines. Movement is such a core component, and there's been just mounds of research that have come out the past few years on what movement does for attention, what movement does for learning, what it does for memory. The book Spark by Dr. John Rady has been just one of these foundational texts in my life, where they talk about, for some people like me with ADHD, when you pair movement before with learning after, it can be as impactful as stimulants for some people. Like, it's just so foundational. And I think we've forgotten that movement is part of the learning process. And so when we take that away from students, we just don't see memory, we don't see studying go from short-term to long-term memory. We don't see attention activate for very long. And so if we can help our students get that in, and it doesn't have to be fancy. We don't have to have a bunch of CrossFitters on a college campus. It can be taking the long way to class. But when we get intentional about planning out movement, we see learning and well-being just skyrocket.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I really love your last point. And I know I've heard you talk about this before. The idea that if you're in a support setting where, I'm going to meet with the student and we're going to talk about applying for jobs, or we're going to talk about, figuring out our major, let's do that while walking across campus, right? We don't have to sit in a table across from each other in such a sedentary position, but instead let's move around. And we don't need to run. I don't like running, but I will walk all day, every day. In fact, I got my lunchtime walk in just before we hopped on this call. And I think that can be such a profound and impactful way of really helping support students in a way that gets their brain going. It changes the environment. It makes it feel a little less formal and rigid, and maybe opens up a more friendly conversation. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research coming out. One of the great things is that when you talk to educators, they'll do stuff because they know it works intuitively, and then they'll later find out that there's research behind it. There's a lot of research coming out, especially for defensive students. If I were to work with a defensive student and we were looking eye to eye like we are right now, well, the amygdala is firing. They're, in a situation with someone they view as an authority figure, and it can be intimidating. But if we're walking, the brain just relaxes and you get a much more authentic view from the student, and you're working in activity.
That's awesome. One of the great challenges I personally have is that when I walk, I often listen to a podcast. I told you before we started recording, I love podcasts. And then my mind starts firing and I have all these ideas. And so I try to not have my phone out when I'm walking, but then I think of ideas. And if I don't, make a note on my phone, I'm never going to remember. So I have this constant, push-pull between wanting to document the thought that came into my mind, because my mind's in a really good place when I'm walking in the fresh air, and, but not wanting to get out the phone and be distracted by it. So I've sort of started using a small notebook and a pen that I carry around, and I literally just stop, and I probably look a little odd, in the middle of the sidewalk scribbling notes, but I'm okay with that, right? Because I don't want to lose that train of thought.
Well, again, I want to pause you real quick, because what you just said is so important for many of our students. The fact that you get a thought and immediately get it out of your head and into your organizational system, that's exactly what we're trying to do for our students. They'll have a thought like, I need to buy deodorant. And that will just, especially for our perfectionist students, they replay their to-do list in their head all day, every day. And it just eats up working memory and it ramps up anxiety. So teaching our students, okay, a to-do just came up, let's get it in your organizational system now. That's so much of the work.
That's great. And my two children would tell you sometimes they're part of my organizational system, and that we'll be driving somewhere and I'll think of something and I'll tell my son who's, 11 and forgets everything. Hey, don't forget, we got to get more hockey tape for the tournament this weekend. And then, 2 days later, I'll say, you were supposed to remind me. How am I supposed to remember that? Right.
That may not be the most reliable system, but that's.
Yeah, exactly. I gotta, we don't let him have a phone, but I got to get him to carry a notepad too, so that he can take notes when I'm spouting off all the things we need to do. So I think we'll come back to this movement piece as much as you'd like throughout our conversation today, because again, I think it's something we have within our program here at Mercyhurst. We have a program called Full Spectrum Fitness, where we offer a couple times a week for students to participate in a training session in a smaller, more kind of sensory friendly gym that's led by a strength and conditioning coach from our athletic staff. So
so cool.
We take it intentionally, but I also have very much aspirations for doing more and more. So I'm always eager to learn.
Sorry to keep chiming in, but
no, please do.
But when I spoke about the foundation of the executive function pyramid, I said structure is in there as well. If we're going to tell a student, we know may struggle with balancing everything, you have to get movement, which we are. If we are intentional too about giving them opportunities to have a structured environment, it's much more easy for me to show up to a class than it is for me to plan out a workout on my own and follow through and develop all this willpower. So you're knocking off a ton of pieces of this executive function development with one program. Yeah,
that's awesome. We love it, and we're constantly trying to figure out how to expand it and do more, with limited resources and all those things, but it's been really successful for us. So I wondered if you might share, and we've come across a couple of these already, but maybe in a little more detail, some of the more common executive function skill gaps, for lack of a better term, that you might see with students who are, gearing up for the transition to college, or any of the college students that you might work with.
Yeah, the hard thing about executive function skills is they all tie together. So an example is procrastination is closely linked to emotional regulation. So a lot of us think about procrastination strictly as behavior. Well, we're finding more and more in the research that it's actually very emotional. We feel overwhelmed by something that's too big, a presentation or talking to a professor that seems overwhelming. And so we back away from it because we're emotionally overwhelmed by it. So helping students sit with that emotional regulation, that can look a lot of different ways. For productivity purposes, sometimes it's just sitting there with them when they feel really uncomfortable and letting it burn a little bit versus going right to our phone and just let those emotions settle. And then often we can get started. We can also look at breaking things into small pieces, which aren't as emotionally overwhelming. So there's a lot of this emotional regulation piece that's actually closely tied to productivity. I know we think a lot of it about mental health, but there's definitely that component. But there's a lot with productivity we can do as well. So emotional regulation is a big one. And then the one that I'm always really, really preaching is the metacognition one. So metacognition is just a fancy word for thinking about how you think, or do you understand your thinking? It's our students that understand themselves are the ones who just crush on campus, and even further, do very well in life. It's people who have a deep understanding of themselves. So asking them a lot of questions to try to figure out what setting do they work best in. Is it a quiet library setting or a loud coffee shop setting? If they had to learn something quickly, how would they do it? Teaching them how they study. And there's so many questions we can ask that once they develop these metacognition skills, we're really working downhill.
That's really good. And you've highlighted a lot of questions that we talk about with our students, throughout their time with us. And one of the most common questions I get when I talk with families who are, thinking about going to college and participating in a program like ours is, what's your typical student like, or what's your average student like, or what does everybody do? And I just can't stress enough to families, and this is where I want your perspective on how unique it is for each student in terms of their support needs, the way they learn, the way they think, the way they go about their day. Everybody is quite significantly different. And there's obviously themes and there's commonalities, but the way that one learner thinks and processes information may vary drastically from their roommate or the person across the hall from them. Does that align with kind of what you see in the students that you work with?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I think it's all of us, right? If I were to ask you, okay, you have an hour to learn something deeply, like that'd probably be a very different answer than what I would give. And so we all learn differently. And again, coming back to organization, there's no two organizational systems that are the same. What will work for you may not work for me. And so we get there through a lot of questions. And then eventually students are like, oh, that's how I learn. That's how I need to structure my day. That's what the hour before bedtime needs to look like for me to wind down so I can get good sleep. And so again, it's just this self-understanding. The people that understand themselves, especially the college students, they're just fine, right? I had zero self-understanding for my first 2 or 3 years of college, and my grades reflected that.
That's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. So I probably should have got into this a little bit more in the beginning, but we've already referred numerous times that you work in a practice that provides executive functioning coaching for students, and a lot of what we do at our university, Mercyhurst, and our support program is, really executive functioning support with some other things sprinkled in, right? Give me the kind of the basic explanation of what your group does in terms of executive functioning. Are students meeting regularly? Is it group? Is it individual? Maybe just the kind of quick 101 version of what you do at Untapped Learning.
Yeah, we work with middle school, high school, and college students. For our college students that are remote, we'll meet with them twice per week. So 30 minutes on a Monday, 30 minutes on a Thursday or Friday. That first meeting is reflecting on the previous week, a lot of metacognition stuff, planning out what needs to happen this week, looking through portals, looking through assignments, looking through self-care to-dos, getting movement in. So there's a lot of planning and reflection that first meeting. And the second meeting is a lot of accountability. And so, especially if you have ADHD, you need quick feedback loops, right? Like you just need them coming quick. And so that's a lot of what we do, is help set students up for success and then provide that accountability on the back end. And it's highly relationship based, because we're going to ask our students to do hard things. So it gets pretty complicated in there within that high level view, because all of our students have different programs. So for example, like if we had a student with processing speed challenges, we're going to need to plan their week out very differently than if a student has hyperactive ADHD without processing challenges. So it gets complicated within there, but that's a lot of what you do with executive function support, is help people build out a life that works for them.
That's great. And can you talk a little bit about how you try to build these skills with the students, not just do the work for them, right? I can only assume you're not just creating the schedule for them, they do it, and then they come back and say, okay, where's my schedule for next week, right? It's this collaborative approach. The idea of moving away from being dependent upon you to do that, and more self-direction and self-initiation on the planning. I assume that's the case.
Oh my gosh, yeah. No, I don't want to be talking to these kids when they're 30, right? Like the goal is give them the skills and have move on. And then when they hit the next road bump in their life, they can come back and see us. But the goal is independence here. And the goal is for them to figure out not only what systems work, but what structures work. So we do everything through the Navy SEAL discipline equals freedom mentality, right? All of our students are after more freedom. And how do we get to that? There's these small disciplines we can implement in their life to give them that freedom, right? So we spoke about one, getting a little bit of movement in makes your learning much more efficient. You're actually spending less time studying and more time learning. If I get a college students to go to office hours with their TA or their professor, especially if they have an ADHD or they're having difficulties with procrastination, that 30 minutes with the TA or professor save them an hour and a half to 2 hours on the back end by the time they get started, maintain attention, follow through, and so on. Things like setting up automatic Amazon orders for deodorant, right? It's like all these little structures we can do open up a ton of freedom. And that's a lot of our work as well. And to be honest, anybody who's working with students at universities, it's teaching them what structures they need to implement so they can have more freedom.
That's awesome. I love that. And you gave a wonderful presentation at a conference back in July that I had the chance to attend. And I enjoyed so much of what you said, but the discipline equals freedom was one of those takeaways that I've heard that phrase. There's a very popular podcaster that uses that all the time. But it really stuck with me in terms of how we approach that with our students, and the idea of little disciplines woven in throughout their life, and not just academically, not just making friends, not just finding that job, but holistically can really open up the avenues for so many other opportunities for growth. And I've had that conversation numerous times with some of our students of, if we can get this thing in order, then it's likely going to help this other unrelated yet very, very important piece of your life as well. And I think it's just so important to understand how all these things are connected. And you've mentioned it several times already, which I think is really valuable.
Well, and this has been the surprise for me, and maybe you had this experience as well, but I didn't think that was going to land with college students, because that's like Jocko Willink. He's like the most hardcore guy, right? Yeah. And the crazy thing is it's landing because that's what our students want. And I think when you're neurodivergent, one of the challenges is that people keep throwing therapies on you, right? You need extra time to do this. You need this OT growing up. You need this therapist. You need all these things. And then you don't have any free time just to keep up with everyone else. Not even mention if you're an athlete on top of that, right? And so Yeah, I think it's refreshing for people to say like, no, we're trying to actually save you time here. And it's true.
Yeah. And the idea that the quicker you can figure out what you need to do for everything, right? In terms of your homework and your reading and your studying, but also your fitness and also making sure you've eaten and making sure your floor's vacuumed once in a while and like all these things, right? The sooner you knock those things out rather than all of this, task transition and switching modes, that it's just going to leave more time at the end, right? Your balance of free time to sit and play video games or whatever your activity might be, you're just going to have more time to do that. And that's, I feel like I have the same conversation with my children. I have the same conversation with myself, right? Like if I want to go for that long walk around the park, I got to get these things done or else I'm going to be anxious that entire walk and not really enjoy it, right? And I think that's very much what we're trying to work with our students on, of come up with the things you need to do, organize them, figure it out, get to it, and then it'll just leave a lot of freedom at the end of the day for you.
Yeah, and what you said is spot on. Growing up with ADHD, I live in constant chaos. I'm always losing stuff. I'm always running behind. People are always mad at me because I didn't turn something in. And I didn't believe that message at first because I had to like actually play it out. And the other piece of it too is I thought it was going to make my life really boring if I had these routines, right? When I walk in the door now, I put my keys in the same spot. And I promise my life is not boring because I can find my keys, right? I don't need to make up stories about how someone broke into my house and just stole my keys and nothing else and hid them in the couch cushions, right? It's like, I know where my stuff is. So I have this room, this space to do what I want to do. And so that I think was a huge hurdle for me. And I think it's a hurdle for a lot of students that you and I see too, is this will actually open up freedom. And once they see it, it's like, bam, they're ready to run with it.
Yeah, and freedom leads to so many good things. Physically, from a mental health perspective, there's a lot of good that comes through it if you get all the things you got to get done first. So that's really good. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about self-advocacy. I think we've already talked with many things that kind of fall under that umbrella, but I think just the concept is something that we talk a lot with our students and with their families about, the need for developing self-advocacy in so many different ways and approaches. And that being a skill that maybe they don't come into college with in a really good place, but for them to succeed in the real world afterwards, it's going to be really important. And I could go into a myriad of ways in which that plays out both on the college campus, but afterwards. But I'd love to hear your take on self-advocacy and how it works into the way you work with students.
Yeah, so much of this for the verbal self-advocacy is just role play. So if you're in a position where you can role play with a student, like, okay, you have to go ask for extra time or for testing accommodations or whatever that looks like, having that conversation. Sometimes I'm even the student and they're the professor, they're whoever, because, first time we role play it, it's pretty messy, and that's how it's going to come out usually. Like it's going to come out that first try anyway. And it's really hard to teach students how to advocate in a way that's clear about what they need, kind, and doesn't come off as entitled. I think the number one comment you and I probably hear is these students are in college, they should know how to do this. They should. Well, they don't. And so taking a few minutes to role play verbally, I mean, that's just a skill that gives you so much bang for your buck. It makes everyone's life easier. It's a skill that transfers into job interviews, into future conversations with spouses. And so role playing the verbal side. For the written side, it's gotten a little bit easier with AI, but our students used to write everything in the subject line of the email, and that was just obnoxious. So one of the things we do now, and this could be done in like a freshman seminar or any other setting, but just write a draft email with them to a professor asking for what they need and what their accommodations, and just leave it in their draft inbox and be like, whenever you feel stuck or you need to advocate, just copy and paste his emails and change the relevant details. And you'd be amazed how much anxiety that calms in students. And so with self-advocacy, it's just a lot of role playing. Whether it's verbal or written, they just don't know how to do it right now. And they should maybe, but they don't. And so we just, it takes a lot of practice.
It does. Yeah. I think practice and repetition is key. And then, something we talk a lot about are celebrating the wins, right? When a student is able to advocate for themselves and in that situation works out favorably for them, often receiving an accommodation or something they're fully entitled to, or some support element that they very much deserve, we need to celebrate that and talk about what happened and how to go and why are you now better off because of that, and how can that transfer into the next instance where you're going to do that, and can you think about future examples where that may be the case. And you mentioned one that we talk about often with our students, the job interview process, right? And being willing to advocate for accommodations during the job interview process truly can make or break whether a neurodivergent job seeker is able to get to the finish line and receive that job, or if they're just going to stumble through the interview process and not be able to show their true self because of that lack of, self-confidence and self-advocacy. So I think celebrating the wins is a huge component of it as well.
Huge. And thank you for bringing that up, because that's positive reinforcement. And often these are the students who just don't get much positive reinforcement. And that's why they're often so defensive, is because they haven't received that. And not even for us, I know it's not even just positively reinforcing when they do get the accommodation, it's positively reinforcing the attempt. Because so many of them are so just nervous about walking up to a professor or TA in that situation. So praising the attempt first, and then we move on from there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Our audience is ideally families and students who are, getting ready to enter this college journey. Do you have any kind of, specific tangible tips that you might give to those folks who are, really starting to think of, hey, I'm going to college in, 6 months or 8 months or even a year? What are some, basic things they may be able to take away from this conversation to implement in their lives right away?
So much what we talked about. Learning how to advocate is huge. Like this is, it's such a big deal, and so often do we role play that. So I love that. Having some semblance of an organizational system. The amount of students that you and I see who don't even have like a beginning, they're like, my middle school teacher made me use a planner once, and like that's all they have, right? And so having some type of system, because it's going to change over time, and there's no two organizational systems that are the same. Like you and I have different organizational systems, but we both made it here on time, right? And so having a start of an organizational system, and then like we spoke before, like having some type of routine around sleep and movement. So those would be the three: is advocacy, organizational system, and sleep and movement. I guess that's four. But
yeah, that's fantastic. And one of the things I talk with our families about during the Prospective process, and thinking about the transition, is the more you can have your student involved in the whole process, the better, right? So quite often we'll interact with families where mom, dad, or grandma or grandpa, or whoever is driving the process, right? They're the one reaching out to the university. They're the one that's filling out the application. They're the one that's scheduling the appointment. They're the one that does all the talking when the interview comes, right? We understand that, and there's a role for that, but we want to see the student more and more and engaged and active in practicing those key skills as early as possible. And, one of the basic examples we often talk about is if the student has an IEP or a 504 plan and there's regular meetings, have that student part of that process, not just sitting in the room, half asleep or playing on their phone. Have them ask questions, right? Have them come to that meeting prepared to ask questions based on their previous plan, right? Get engaged, find ways to have that student know what they're getting into, so that those first couple of weeks on campus, they know what questions to ask. They're comfortable with understanding what accommodations they had in the past and whether those actually play out in the college setting. And I just think that there's so much to be gained from those experiences, some of which are maybe going to go poorly and maybe not going to go as according to plan. But the repetition is really one of the things that we find is key for success in this transition.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge the fear here, because I know it can be scary for a parent, because it is a big deal where your student decides to go to college. So I want to acknowledge that, and I know that's why a lot of parents want to drive it. I have not seen a better executive function skill building setup in high school than applying for college. You have all of these options. You have all these mini tasks that need to be done. There's things like getting letters of recommendation. There's all these different essays for different schools. They're weighing pros and cons and spreadsheets. Working through that with your student while having them drive it will build a lot of executive function skills. And if we take that over, we rob them of that ability to have that.
So you mentioned a few of these already, but I'm curious if you have any specifics that come to mind in terms of any, apps or digital tools or planners or, anything that helps, build and solidify a routine. Anything you'd suggest in that space?
Not a ton of like apps and tips and tricks. There is a lot of accountability. To be honest, like I don't know about you, but I use reminders on my iPhone mixed with Google Calendar because it pops up in multiple places. And so finding something like that for your student, like if I used a planner, I would just donate it to the local coffee shop because I leave my stuff everywhere, right? And so there's so many productivity apps, and if that works for your student and they're the ones updating it daily, great. If they want to use a Pomodoro technique and have a timer, great. It's the ones that we're consistent with. And so using, again, positive reinforcement and a lot of accountability there on whatever, they get to choose the system. And then whatever system they choose, we hold them accountable for that system. I think that's the way to look at it the most. And to be honest, most high school seniors we see don't have the starts of a really good organizational system. They don't have movement lockdown, and they don't have sleep lockdown. We haven't talked about that yet. And if you don't have those three, we're not ready to talk about apps yet.
That's good. I mean, I want to circle back to sleep here next, but I agree with you. I use the Reminders app. It's super simple. I'm sure there's many out there with far better bells and whistles, but it's simple, and I can quickly get something out of my brain into my phone and know that I can circle back to it when I have more chance to do that. And I think, again, we've been talking about practice and repetition. I think that's a really good thing for students to start working on in their junior, senior years of high school, of even if it's just basic things like changing the laundry or showing up to play rehearsal or, need to buy new deodorant, whatever it is, like build that practice, right? Like when you think of something, put it into an app or whatever, and then get in the process of clearing that out and feel the victory of checking the box. Like, yeah, I did that thing, right? That's one of my favorite parts of the day is when towards the end of the day, I look at, I did all these things today. That's fantastic, right? There is that dopamine hit that comes from doing that. And we want our students to start experiencing that. So when they get under pressure, 6 weeks into their first academic semester, ideally those habits are already woven in and they've already, come to know that this is just their process, not picking, one of the more stressful times in their life to try new things and figure out systems. That I love what you said there. I think it's fantastic.
Well, so real quickly, simple's good. You said simple, like you brushed it, like simple's good. The more simple, the better. If you were going to take the next step, especially with planning, I'd highly recommend time blocking. A lot of our students under 20, they've grown up in a social media screen area. And so they don't understand time often the same way a lot of us do. And so time blocking, a way for them to visually see their time. Again, this goes back to this freedom thing, is if I use my study block from 11 a.m. to noon, I'm going to have friend time at the end of the day. So having them see their time, we're having a lot of success with as well. So that would be as fancy as I'd get with it.
I love that. And Cal Newport is, one of those foremost thinkers on that. And I love all Cal Newport work. But I think there's also some value. A lot of the students that we support are on the autism spectrum, and they tend to be very structured and rigid. So if they set that time, 11 to 12 a.m. is when they do their whatever, they're going to do it. And you can guarantee that's going to happen, right? And so I think building in those structures is really valuable. You mentioned sleep, and I'm sort of disappointed in myself we didn't come to this sooner because it's something I'm passionate about, like personally, and I think it's one of the challenges I see with our students, this idea of, hey, we're going to have a meeting at 9 a.m., they think that's, I sleep until 10, right? That doesn't work. And it totally, upsets their schedule and the processes and all those things. So I'd love for you to give me the quick answer as to why sleep is so important for the population of students that we both serve.
Yeah, I love giving advice that I'm terrible at. So with my ADHD, sleep is actually the hardest thing for me. So I've spent my whole life in, there's a lot of research coming out that sleep ADHD especially could be more of a circadian rhythm disruption than anything else. And so acknowledging that a lot of our students just have a hard time sleeping. A lot of times our clocks are backwards. That being said, the basics that you and I know is something that they struggle with when, transitioning to college. It's like, how do I get off screens a reasonable amount of time? Research says at least an hour. That's hard for our students, so I want to be realistic. But, having some semblance of a bedtime routine on school nights. So what happens 30 minutes before you go to sleep? What happens 15 minutes? What happens 10 minutes? What do we need to lay out the night before? Do your clothes need to be laid out? Does your sports bag or your bag you need for the musical need to be packed? Do we need ADHD medication laid out? What needs to happen the night before so when we wake up, we're good to go? A lot of reps there. The reason sleep is so important, it's just, it's one of those lead dominoes that when you get enough amount of sleep, your learning is better, your attention's better, you're kinder, you can do hard things, cognitive space is there. It's probably the most important thing in our health, and it's something we see college freshmen struggle more than any other component.
That's awesome. I think this wasn't on the questions I told you I'd ask, but I'd be curious about this. So you mentioned you've been doing this for quite some time now, and Untapped Learning has grown in terms of the number of students that you serve and the classes you offer. I've seen a couple of your facilities. They're fantastic. Any kind of general observations that you've noticed the past, 5, 7, 10 years in terms of trends you're seeing that students are either challenged with or are seeing as, key moments as they're preparing for the transition into college?
I spoke to one of them before. Procrastination has just jumped up in the past few years. We're frying our dopamine on social media right now, and it makes it really hard to get started and do long, monotonous tasks. So that's the one that comes to mind immediately. Sleep actually is really, in the past few years, we're just keeping our brains active later and later. So that's been a struggle for our students. Some of the good things is I do see students much more aware of how important movement is. And I do see students, they're really kind right now. I'm not sure if you have that experience as well. I think this generation gets a lot of negative rap, but I could not be more impressed with the kindness and the wanting to do good in this generation. And then I get frustrated with the procrastination.
Yeah, no, I agree. There are a lot of really kind, wonderful students, and procrastination is no doubt evident in a lot that we do. You have an incredible podcast yourself. I'd love to hear you talk about what that has been like for you. But I know one of the things I've heard regularly on your podcast are conversations with student athletes that you've worked with or those who are around student athletes. I think that's a pocket of students who are up against a tremendous challenge, trying to juggle, intercollegiate athletics plus academics. And here at Mercyhurst, I know in general, our student athlete population has a higher grade point average typically than the non-student athlete population, right? So there's also this myth that because they play sports, they're not smarter, they don't work hard. When in reality, I think it's quite often the inverse. Can you talk about the support that you've seen specifically for those who play, collegiate athletics, and whether that differs any, or if there's any kind of trends and key concepts that you work with in that population?
Yeah. The myth of the meathead athlete is that's an old myth. I know you're around college athletes a lot. They have to learn so much, whether it's the playbook for whatever sport, whether it's, you're scouting the other team, you're watching film. People don't realize you have to be a learning machine. And so unless you have those skills down, you kind of get filtered out throughout the process. The reason why executive function skills are so challenging or so challenging for them is because they've had everything structured their entire lives. If they're at a Division I school like yours, especially, everything's been structured, all the practices, school. And so when they get a little bit of free time, they struggle with that. And then there's just so much to balance, right? You have to do all your classes. You have to scout the other team. You have to watch film. You have to be in the weight room. And it's a lot to manage. And we see anxiety ramp if they don't have really good systems and structure. And then you add in the travel component when they're missing class and have to advocate. And you just have to be really, really organized and have good self-advocacy skills.
Yeah, it's funny. You think about athletic and competition and you think about routine, when in reality, when you're in season especially, the concept of routine for so many student athletes is just out the window, right? If you go to class Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then you get on a bus Thursday and you go in here and you go in there, it's unbelievable the schedule that the student athletes, are dealt and expected to perform and do homework on a bus or, write their papers in a hotel room. And yet, they do it. And I'm constantly amazed and impressed. And it's an amazing thing to see, but my goodness, they overcome a lot of hurdles that they have no control over.
Yeah. Your self-understanding, your metacognition has to be phenomenal to be a high level student athlete. The question I gave you earlier, if you only have an hour to learn this, how do you do it? That's a very real question for a lot of student athletes because that's all they have. And, I feel for them, and at the same time, they're growing so quickly. And so you have to be incredibly organized and you have to be a great learner. And it rocks a lot of our students, that transition from high school to college. And that's where supports like what you guys do is so impactful. That's the biggest transition most students will face. I think we kind of brush that under the rug is, when you leave college and get a job, well, you've still been independent, right? And so for a lot of us, that transition from home to independence, it's hard and you have to learn a lot very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned earlier you have a podcast. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your podcast. I think it's a great resource and people should go listen to it, and maybe some lessons you've learned from those conversations.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's called Executive Function for All, and we'll have to have you on sometime soon. I'd love to have you on. And I talk to both experts in both experts in the executive function world. That's how, I continue to learn. And so we talk to experts, and then we also talk to students who struggled at one point and had to work themselves through, because there's a huge, especially with student athletes, there's a huge misconception that nobody's struggling when a lot of us are. And that comes from, a lot of us don't want to take support because we're worried that there's a stigma behind it. And to hear from others that have struggled and worked themselves through it not only decreases the stigma, but it gives great insights to others.
That's fantastic. Well, you've given us a ton of great resources through our conversation today. I'd love to give you a chance to promote, the organization you work for, kind of how best to connect with you or find more information about the services you provide.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if our website is untappedlearning.com, and we help students across the country build these executive function skills, especially in the transition or right before the transition. So we have a ton of resources. We have podcasts, we have YouTube videos, whatever we can do to support.
Highly recommend it all. It's been really good stuff. I've really enjoyed being able to connect with you over the past, year or two it's been, and I'm very confident today won't be our last conversation, and I hope for further cooperation and collaboration. But thanks so much for taking some time with me today, Brandon.
Ryan, you're awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast, a product of the Brad McGarry Center for Neurodiversity at Mercyhurst University. We're grateful for you joining us. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out our past episodes, and we would be grateful if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help it reach more people interested in this topic. We hope you'll subscribe. You can do that on all of those channels as well as our YouTube channel. And be sure to tell a friend. Thanks again to Jack and Gia for their support on this podcast, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Friendly reminder to stay tuned to updates from the Brad McGarry Center for Neurodiversity at mercyhurst.edu/neurodiversity, or check the show notes for our social media feeds. Until next time, carpe diem.